Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Haram, and I'm going to be doing a scholarly synthesis and data application on procedural fidelity in applied behavior analysis. In our research, we define procedural fidelity and use it interchangeably with treatment integrity as a degree to which an intervention is implemented as designed. However, Cooper et al. Does create a clear distinction between those two terms. They define treatment integrity to refer to the extent to which the independent variable is implemented as planned, while procedural fidelity is more accurately referred to as the extent to which the procedures in the conditions are correctly implemented, and this includes baseline, not just the intervention. Now, the importance of fidelity. So, fidelity ensures that interventions are delivered correctly. It helps to protect internal validity, meaning that the dependent variable is the reason for the dependent variables, the change cost of change in behavior. And it helps determine if those outcomes are due to that intervention and not other factors. And it supports those evidence-based practices that we find in our research to be independent variables. So it is essential because without procedural fidelity data, we cannot determine whether the behavior changes are due to the intervention or inconsistent implementation. Now we have several methods are commonly used to measure fidelity. The first being direct observation, and this is a more accurate method. It uses task analysis, checklists, and observers record implementation behavior. The next is permanent product review, and this evaluates completed materials and work samples. Then we have self-reporting or rating scales. So this is where staff report their own implementation. And this can be through 3-point or 5-point Likert scales. And lastly is the component-based recording. So this identifies specific errors in the procedures. So direct observation does remain to be the preferred method across a literature review. Now, to calculate procedural fidelity, we use a formula and calculate it as a percentage. So we do the correct number of steps divided by the total steps times 100. Other calculation methods include component level percentages, trial-based percentages, duration or frequency measures. Most fidelity data are reported as percentages. However, looking at individual components instead of just the overall percentages does help identify specific errors in implementation. So we want to look at specific areas and not just overall percentages of fidelity. Sorry. Next slide is the procedural fidelity, treatment effectiveness, and social validity. No, procedural fidelity is directly related to a treatment effectiveness. So, how effective that treatment was, internal validity, whether that independent variable affected the dependent variable behaviors and caused a change, and social validity, whether the stakeholders felt that that intervention was valuable and ethically valid. So when we have high procedural fidelity, it leads to better intervention outcomes, it improves skill acquisition, and greater consistency across providers. Research shows that high procedural fidelity improves the intervention outcomes. Fidelity also supports social validity by making those interventions more consistent and acceptable in real-world settings. Now, there are some strategies for improving fidelity. We can do staff trainings through behavioral skills trainings. We can provide performance feedback based on observations, create consistent treatment manuals, and do ongoing supervision and regular fidelity monitorings. Training, supervision, and feedback are among the most effective ways to improve fidelity. Written protocols and consistent monitoring help to ensure that those interventions are being delivered accurately. Now, reporting standards in published research. So, across our peer-reviewed sources, there are recommended reporting practices. So, we want to know how fidelity was defined, how the fidelity was measured, the different components assessed, calculations procedures used for those percentages, frequency of fidelity checks, and summary of data. Now, in our research, there wasn't any universal standard for fidelity levels. However, most research identified 80% to be acceptable. Cooper et al. Did highlight in their standards, according to the National Autism Center for Scientific Merit Rating Scales, that treatment integrity should be measured at a minimum of 25% of sessions at or above at or above 80% accuracy with an inner observer agreement of greater than or equal to 80% to be considered acceptable. Now for my part two, the part two is in application and data analysis. So for this section, I created hypothetical procedural fidelity data across 3 sessions of a behavioral intervention plan, calculated that fidelity as a percentage of correctly implemented steps. I provided a graph and interpretation of that data. So here is my behavior intervention fidelity checklist. For this example, I used a 10-step fidelity checklist. And then during each session, there was a score of correct and incorrect for each of the 10 steps. So first, we delivered an antecedent reminder. We presented a task as written. We used least to most prompting, delivered reinforcement immediately, withheld reinforcement for problem behavior, redirected replacement behavior, recorded behavior data, provided the behavior specific praise, followed break procedure correctly, and then ended session according to plan. So here is my behavior intervention plan fidelity data table. So this table shows a step-by-step fidelity checklist among the 3 sessions that we have. So here we can see in session 1, we had 2 errors, while session 2 had 3 errors, and session 3 had 1 error. And I just wanted to point out here in our data, we can see that there's a consistency in error with withholding reinforcement for the problem behavior, as well as following the break procedures. And that's important to know for our future data analysis. Now, for our calculations, procedural fidelity was calculated by dividing the number of steps correctly implemented by the total number of steps and multiplying that by 100. So for session 1, we did 8 correct steps divided by 10 total steps times 100 to get 80%. For session 2, we did 7 correct steps divided by 10 total steps times 100 to get 70%. And for session 3, we did 9 correct steps divided by 10 total steps times 100 to get 90%. So this resulted in fidelity scores of 80, 70, and 90% across all of 3 sessions. Now here is a graph of our fidelity across sessions. So this line graph shows us here session 1, 2, and 3. So in session 1, we see we started off with 80%, and in session 2, there was a drop to 70%. And in session 3, there was an increase to 90%. So the pattern suggests that there is some inconsistency in implementation, but that there is room for improvement as the scores did go up to 90%. Now for interpretations of findings. So our data shows that fidelity ranged from 70% in session 2 to 90% in session 3, and there was a moderate fidelity overall. There was variability across the sessions. So here in session 1 to session 2, there was a drop followed by the increase in session 3. So that pattern can suggest that there is some inconsistency in implementation, but there is the room for improvement. That error in session 2 here can reflect drift. If we look back at the data in our table, we do notice here that there is the break procedure error consistency here, and then there's a consistency with the errors in withholding reinforcement for problem behavior. So that in our data here could be the reason for those drop in numbers. Session 2 could reflect a drift in competing classroom demands or unclear procedures in those break routines. The repeated error break could suggest that it is one of the steps of that BIP plan that needs clarification and more training. And then lastly is our recommendations and impact on outcomes. So there are some recommendations to improve fidelity. We can have additional staff training to really clarify those steps that are unclear, such as the withholding of reinforcement for problem behavior and the correct break procedures in those errors in that table. We can also provide performance feedback after observation so that the person implementing the intervention can understand where their errors lie. We can also provide task analysis checklists during implementation to accurately understand all the procedures and ongoing fidelity checks to monitor improvement. Now, what kind of impact does the data have on client outcomes? So, lower inconsistency fidelity does make it difficult to know whether the BIP itself is effective. And also, client behaviors may continue if steps are missed. If the reinforcement is not being delivered appropriately, it may low that client's motivation and may create problem behaviors because it's not being accurately implemented. An inaccurate implementation may make a good intervention appear ineffective. So, improving procedural fidelity improves both the treatment accuracy and client outcomes. Without consistent implementation, effective interventions may appear ineffective, leading to inaccurate treatment decisions about how to move forward for our client. And this is my references, and that is my presentation. Thank you.